is a distributed network, whether it's banks or simply borrowers and lenders. There's not really that much hierarchical structure in a credit speculation, amongst other things, into a protracted period of deflation. What we would probably today talk about as stagnation.
So it won't be the first time in history that the US changes tack when the presidency changes. I think Europeans will be overjoyed.
Globalization peaked in around 2007 in terms of flows of capital, of goods, migration, and perhaps also in terms of the flow of ideas, because that's also important. The financial crisis was the first major setback to globalization, unless you count the financial crises of the 1980s and 1990s, which didn't really derail it. The financial crisis did. There were significant structural changes that followed from that. Capital flows did not recover to their pre-crisis level. And then you had a migration crisis in Europe a few years later that I think elicited a backlash. So we saw a backlash against globalization on both sides of the Atlantic, 2016. The pandemic came on top of that. And in one way, you might have expected that to validate the populist narrative. After all, here was a disease that originated in China, that spread because of global transportation. And I remember wondering if this wasn't a kind of heaven-sent opportunity for populists to say, we told you so. But it didn't work out that way. Actually, it hurt populists. It cost Donald Trump re-election, and the populists in Europe all did really poorly. They'd already suffered a setback in 2019. 2020 was a terrible year for populism and a great year for Greens. And that seems to me to be one of the paradoxes of this crisis, that it hasn't actually hammered a nail into the coffin of globalization at all. In fact, I think in some ways, you've seen a revitalization of international cooperation in the field of science, and you're seeing a realization that you cannot actually have an America first approach to vaccination because you haven't solved the problem of COVID-19 if the thing is still raging in the Southern Hemisphere or if it's still raging in South Asia. So I think rumors of the death of globalization were a little overstated last year. Globalization is going to survive this pandemic, and it may even in some ways be revived by it. The most important things in a pandemic, according to the epidemiologist Larry Brilliant, are early detection and early action. And we did neither of those things. And I think that was partly because our public health bureaucracies hadn't really learnt the lessons of SARS and MERS. That is to say, they hadn't really thought about what a very contagious coronavirus might do. They were kind of ready for an influenza pandemic. They were slightly thrown. But I think there's also a more general problem of just sluggishness of response. The atmosphere in Washington, even in mid-February, I remember because I was there, was one of extraordinary complacency. People were telling themselves fairy stories about why the vaccine would not particularly impact the United States, why the virus would not particularly impact the United States. And that just seemed to me astonishing, since it so obviously was going to. There wasn't a single reason why it wouldn't, because there had been flights from Wuhan into John F. Kennedy and into San Francisco Airport throughout December and January until January the 23rd. So I think we were more than just poorly prepared. We were wrongly prepared. We on paper had lots of preparation for a pandemic, especially in the US, but also in the UK and in Europe. It's just that none of it worked. And that reduced us to this very suboptimal solution after we'd let the virus spread out of control of lockdowns. The Taiwanese never had to lock down. There's never been a nationwide lockdown in South Korea. The movie Contagion is very dramatic. What happened in Taiwan wasn't very dramatic. I mean, you just had to kind of very quickly create lots and lots of tests. And that's kind of boring. You just need to have lots and lots of people who know how to make test kits and how to distribute them. And then you have to figure out how to get a contact tracing app to work and get people to use it. And all of that stuff is just dull. It's inherently a kind of nuts and bolts kind of response. And that, for whatever reason, our bureaucracies were unable to do. I think there was a clear failure at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention with testing. I mean, they not only limited the ability of other people to make tests, but then they produced a test that didn't work. And so that was a kind of very classic failure of a centralized, very sclerotic bureaucracy. Then you had the slightly more puzzling failure of the big tech companies in the US to make contact tracing happen, which they could have done. After all, it wasn't like there was some technological advantage the Taiwanese had that we lacked. I think it's absolutely clear that in the United States, there was a failure on the part of the big tech companies to make available contact tracing apps that existed. I mean, they just wouldn't host them on the app stores, and they took a conscious decision to punt responsibility for contact tracing to state governments, which was really like just putting the ball into the longest possible grass. That was never going to work, and they knew it. And I think that was because the Google and Apple leadership, and I imagine the lawyers who advised them, came to the conclusion that there were downside risks to doing it that might elicit a backlash. They feared, I suspect, that they would be accused of creating a surveillance state. At any event, they decided not to do it. And that meant that we missed the opportunity to exploit technology to contain or at least limit the spread of the virus. And we're forced to rely on the very blunt instrument of lockdowns. I think it's true to say that countries in Europe that tried failed. The Germans tried and failed. And Britain tried and failed. In the British case, I think it was because the technology sucked. In the German case, it may have been a problem of public take up. But you look back and you say, well, here's your choice. Would you like to have a contact tracing app or be locked in your home for an unspecified period of weeks? A smart society takes the contact tracing app. What I think is crucial is that in the United States, particularly, public health issues have become politicized in a way they didn't used to be. So in the 1950s, when the US was able to find a vaccine for the Asian flu really quickly, everybody celebrated. And Morris Hillman, the guy who did it, was kind of a figure of public esteem. Mm-hmm. The sense that it was rather admirable that the US led the world in vaccines in the 1950s was quite apart from politics. And there were no people accusing, the Eisenhower administration of trying to pursue a partisan agenda. So I think that's the big difference. It's not so much that there are crazy ideas out there. I think there are crazy ideas everywhere, thanks to the internet. It's the fact that everything became a political issue in 2020. Masks, hydroxychloroquine, and then vaccines. And that meant that you couldn't get a consensus. You still can't on vaccines because everything's political. And I think that's one of the things that made me call the book The Politics of Catastrophe, because it's really politics that decides how catastrophic an event is. It may start as a natural disaster, but your politics will decide how many people end up dying. The death toll in Taiwan is 12, right? 12 people, or is it 13, have died from COVID. Not 12,000, 12. And in the US, we're heading for 600,000. So something went wrong. It's easy to say it was Trump, and a lot of people have made that argument. And in the book, I list, I think, pretty much all the mistakes he made, and there were dozens. But the idea that if Trump had not been president and Obama had been, or Biden had been, or Clinton had been, that we'd somehow not have had 500,000 deaths, I don't believe that, because I don't think the president is that crucial in a crisis like this. I think we need to recognize that there's something much more structurally wrong with the way the US responded, and it's actually true of most European countries too. Oddly enough, the countries that did badly with containment have done really well with vaccines, the UK and the US in particular. Europe's catching up, it will catch up. Very importantly, the best vaccines are really, really good. I mean, the efficacy of the Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines exceeds my expectations when I was writing the book. One of the things I had to ask myself last year was who would win the vaccine race? China was boasting that it would, and Xi Jinping was offering the vaccines to all and sundry. But in truth, China's record on vaccine development was not that good. Although they're not useless, the efficacy of the Chinese vaccines is quite a bit lower. And that shouldn't surprise us. It's earlier technology, and the Chinese just don't have a great track record on vaccine development. So I think that the success of companies like Moderna and BioNTech is really important because it illustrates that the West still has some of what I used to call the killer apps of a successful civilization. We have a very competitive and innovative biotech sector. I think it might be a bit like vaccine resistance, that it kind of fades, and it's just fading a bit more slowly than vaccine resistance. But vaccine resistance is definitely fading. The latest polls show that the reluctance, the people who say they'll never get the vaccine, I mean, the numbers are going down and the wait and sees are going down. And I think as vaccine performance becomes more and more established in the public mind, that will continue to happen, and finally people will no longer really be arguing about the vaccine risks, because there just aren't. I mean, 2 cases of blood clots in a million is not a reason not to get vaccinated. So I wonder if there might be a similar effect with Trump. Trump has kind of vanished from the public sphere since January the 6th. This was the kind of extraordinary thing that happened, that the president of the United States got cancelled. And although there's clearly a lot of Trump loyalism out there, I wonder how sticky that will be over, let us say, the next 3 years, because 3 years is a long time in American politics. The other thing that hasn't really happened yet is that an alternative hasn't fully presented itself to Republican voters. They know they dislike the Biden administration. They're not going to change their minds about that, even if the economy is roaring back to life. So their loyalty to Trump may simply be a kind of vestigial thing. If they're presented with a shiny new version with Trumpist positions but a different face, I wonder if they might not quietly shift. So I have a kind of view, and I said this from really the moment that he'd lost, that he'll fade faster than you think, because this is America. And there aren't second acts, or rarely second acts, in American politics. I think if they have found the magic money tree and can spend $6 trillion in a variety of different ways that get money to Americans or improved services or infrastructure to Americans, then this will contribute to that erosion of support for Trump. The question is that a magic money tree, or is it just the seeds of future inflation that I see in the ground? And that question will be decisive if they are indeed, as Larry Summers has warned, engaged in a kind of massive overkill that is going to overheat the economy and unanchor, if that's the word, inflation expectations. Then things will look very different very quickly, because free stuff is great, but rising prices not so much. And a war over Taiwan would be a much bigger affair than the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, because you'd have to have US bombing of Chinese land-based air facilities. Jim Stavridis imagines in his new book that this would escalate to nuclear strikes. And indeed, it's not clear quite what the end game is. With Trump, it was clear. He wanted a big deal with Xi Jinping that was going to end the trade war and give him a photo opportunity. And that would have been one of his second-term objectives. I don't think that's what Joe Biden's administration is looking for. They seem actually much more ready for a fight over Taiwan, or for that matter, over the Uyghurs or Hong Kong or you name it. I mean, they're picking fights on a broad range of issues. Now, that could just be smart diplomacy. Give the Chinese a few slaps, make them realize that the US isn't so weak, and deter them from taking risk. But if it doesn't work out that way, and the Chinese do launch an invasion of Taiwan or blockade Taiwan next year after the Winter Olympics, then what? Because it's not immediately clear that the US has a good military response in that scenario. Well, let me start by saying that it could have been worse. And if one thinks back to the European response to the financial crisis, especially from a Greek vantage point, it could have been that bad. Ultimately, something very important happened, and that was that Angela Merkel came round to the view, with a little help from Emmanuel Macron, that if you didn't do better this time around than you had done in the financial crisis, then the populists really would win. And I think he deserves credit for creating the political pressure to break the German resistance to any kind of fiscal federalism and make that new generation program happen. And another point which is very important is that Britain's departure makes it easier to run Europe, because you can do fiscal federalism, and Britain was never going to sign up for that. So Brexit is maybe the best thing that could have happened to the European Union. I'm cautiously optimistic that after the shocks of the pandemic, that we'll see Europe catching up with the US and the UK in vaccinations, and that although it won't be an entirely normal summer, it's actually going to be a very much better summer than last year. And ultimately, a pandemic is not like a financial crisis. You get a much more rapid recovery once there is vaccination and natural immunity. So the economic outlook might not be as bright as the US outlook, but I don't think Europe is going to overheat, whereas I think the US probably is going to overheat. So, look ahead another year, we might be saying the Europeans actually got this right and didn't go nuts with fiscal stimulus. Kyriakos Mitsotakis has been tough on the migration issue because he's had to be. Greece cannot be a gateway for migrants of all kinds, whether they're refugees or economic migrants, into Europe. It's simply an intolerable strain. And so it's been an absolutely indispensable part of his leadership to be tough on the migration issue and tough on Turkey. And I think the rest of Europe is kind of coming round to this way of thinking and recognizing that there is no chance of fending off the populists of the right if the migration problem continues. I think that in many ways, Europe is getting tougher on the issue of migration and is in many ways, if you look at opinion polls, rather tougher than the US. Actually, European sentiment is a great deal tougher on migration than American sentiment. That was true even during the Trump presidency. So there's not going to be an open border in Southern Europe anymore. And that helps, I think, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, because he's no longer going to be regarded as being in some kind of naughty corner for being tough on this issue. Everybody has now realized that this is existential for Europe, because you cannot possibly manage the stability of European democracy with really large numbers of people coming in illegally and barely in a controlled way.